She thought she was just doing the right thing, helping the people in her town, looking out for children who had gone missing without a trace. But she had no idea the danger she was walking into. She had stumbled upon something horrifying, something so dark, so twisted that if the wrong people found out, she knew her life would be worth nothing. And that's exactly what happened. She was a woman with a big heart, a steady job, and a family who loved her. She wasn't involved in crime. She wasn't chasing trouble. But trouble found her the moment she got too close to the truth, because she knew something she was never supposed to know. And within days of uncovering it, she was dead. Shot. Execution style. Left in a ditch like her life never mattered. The town was told it was a random act of violence. The case was closed fast, too fast. And the man leading the investigation? The town's own sheriff. A man with a clean badge, a powerful presence, and if you ask the wrong people, secrets buried so deep they could ruin everything. Because what she discovered wasn't just a crime, it was an operation. A machine that moved in silence, trading in something more valuable than money. And the sheriff wasn't just covering it up, he was running it. For weeks before she was murdered, she had been asking questions, not just about the missing children, but about something even more disturbing, why their cases were being ignored, why the people who should have been protecting them weren't doing anything at all, why certain reports disappeared from the system, why records were being erased, and she found answers. Answers that put her directly in the crosshairs of the most powerful man in town. She thought she was careful. She thought she had time. But the moment she realized the truth, the clock started ticking. What really happened to LaToya Harris? What did she find out that sealed her fate? And how did a man who swore an oath to protect and serve become the very monster she needed protection from? This is not just a murder. This is a cover-up. A story of corruption, power, and the terrifying reality of what happens when those in charge believe they are untouchable. But the real question is, how many others have been silenced before their voices could be heard? And how many more will disappear before the truth finally comes out? LaToya was 32 years old, a school teacher, a community volunteer, the kind of person people trusted. She had lived in the town her whole life, watched kids grow up, helped families in need, and never once imagined that her kindness would put her in the path of something deadly. She wasn't an investigator. She wasn't a cop. She was just a woman who saw something wrong and wanted to make it right. But in a town where power meant everything, knowing too much could get you killed. Sheriff Dwayne Calloway had been in charge for over a decade. To most, he was a strong leader, a man who kept the streets safe. But to others, the ones who had seen behind the curtain, he was something else entirely. A man with too much control. A man whose word was law, not because of his badge, but because people knew better than to cross him. His name carried weight, not just in the police department, but in places where laws didn't matter. And when LaToya Harris unknowingly stepped into his world, she had no idea she was walking into a trap she wouldn't escape. She had been working on a charity project, raising money and awareness for children in foster care, children who had been lost in the system. It was a cause close to her heart, something she had dedicated herself to for years. But this time, something didn't sit right. The more she looked into these missing children, the more inconsistencies she found. Names that appeared on reports and then disappeared. Cases that were filed and then closed without explanation. Children who went missing and were never spoken of again. A mother once approached her after one of the charity events, a woman whose child had gone missing months earlier. She was desperate, frantic, trying to find someone who would listen. The police weren't helping, she said. They had written it off as a runaway case, but she knew her child hadn't just left home. Something had happened. And when she tried to push for answers, she was met with silence. No one wanted to talk. No one wanted to help. At first, it was just a curiosity, a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. But then she started asking questions, and the wrong people started paying attention. Somewhere along the way, her charity work put her in the orbit of Sheriff Calloway. Maybe it was an innocent interaction at first, a fundraiser, a meeting, a conversation in passing. But something shifted. Maybe she asked the wrong question. Maybe she mentioned the wrong name. Maybe she looked into something that wasn't meant to be looked at. What is certain is that, before she even realized it, LaToya had stepped into a world she wasn't prepared for, and once she did, there was no way out. Her life went on as normal. At least that's how it seemed. She still went to work, still ran her charity events, still smiled and laughed with friends. But something had changed. She started looking over her shoulder. She stopped talking about her research. And then one day, she told a close friend something strange. "If anything happens to me, don't believe what they say." Days later, LaToya Harris vanished. The night LaToya Harris disappeared, everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. It was a Thursday evening, the end of a long work week, and she had plans to meet a friend at a local diner on the outskirts of town. A quiet spot. Nothing fancy, just a place where the locals grabbed coffee and small talk after work. She left her apartment around 7:30 p.m., wearing a light jacket and carrying the same bag she always did, the one with her notebook inside, the one where she had started writing down everything she had uncovered about the missing children. She had been on edge for days. Friends noticed it. She wasn't sleeping well. She wasn't laughing as much. Something was weighing on her, something she didn't talk about openly. But the signs were there. She had started double-checking her locks at night. She mentioned, offhandedly, that she thought someone had been following her car a few nights before. "Just a feeling," she said. "But feelings like that don't come from nowhere." As she drove to the diner, she sent a quick text to her friend. "Already on the way. Something I need to talk to you about." Her friend responded immediately, asking if she was okay. LaToya never answered. She pulled into the diner parking lot at 7:50 p.m. A few patrons were inside, nursing their coffee, lost in their own lives. But LaToya never made it inside. A witness, a waitress finishing up her shift, later told investigators that she saw LaToya standing outside near her car talking to someone, a man in a black SUV. The conversation didn't seem heated, but LaToya looked tense. She kept glancing around, shifting on her feet, and then after a few minutes she got into the SUV, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. Her friend arrived at the diner around 8:10 p.m., looked around, no LaToya. She called. No answer. At first, she assumed LaToya had just been running late. Maybe she got caught up with something. Maybe she changed her mind about meeting up, but the longer she waited, the more uneasy she became. She sent another text. "Where are you? You okay?" No response. By 10 p.m., she was calling LaToya's phone repeatedly, each ring going straight to voicemail. By midnight, she was knocking on LaToya's apartment door, hoping she was inside, asleep, just missing the calls. But the apartment was dark. The car was gone. And by the next morning, when there was still no sign of her, that feeling in the pit of her stomach turned into something worse. Panic. LaToya's family filed a missing persons report by noon the next day. The police took the statement, asked routine questions, and assured them that she'd probably turn up soon. Adults go missing all the time, they said. Maybe she just needed a break. Maybe she went out of town. But LaToya's friends and family knew better. She wouldn't just vanish. She wouldn't ignore her calls. And she certainly wouldn't leave without telling anyone where she was going. Then came the first chilling clue. That same afternoon, one of her friends received a text from LaToya's number, but something about it felt wrong. The message was short. "I'm fine. Just needed time. Don't worry." But LaToya didn't talk like that. She didn't type like that. Her friend called back immediately, but once again, the phone went straight to voicemail. The uneasy feeling deepened. By the second night, her family started driving around town, checking every place they could think of. They knocked on doors, retraced her steps, asked people if they had seen her. No answers, no leads. It was like she had been swallowed up by the night. Then, on the third day, everything changed. A farmer driving down an old dirt road on the outskirts of town spotted something in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a pile of discarded clothes, maybe trash someone had dumped. But as he got closer, he saw the shape of a body. It was LaToya. She was lying face down in the dirt, arms stiff, legs slightly bent, her body already showing the early signs of decomposition under the unforgiving Texas sun. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence that she had tried to run. And then there was the gunshot wound. A single bullet to the back of her head. Execution style. Someone had wanted her dead. Someone had made sure she never spoke another word. And within hours, Sheriff Dwayne Calloway himself was on the scene, personally overseeing the investigation. His face was unreadable, his orders calm and precise. He called it a robbery gone wrong, told reporters there was no immediate suspect, no evidence that her death was anything more than a tragic coincidence. Case closed. But LaToya's family knew better. They knew she had been scared. They knew she had been looking into something. And most importantly, they knew she had gotten too close to a secret someone would kill to keep buried. And that someone might have been the very man wearing the badge. The moment LaToya's body was discovered, the town should have been shaken to its core. A beloved teacher, a woman who dedicated her life to helping children, found murdered in cold blood, discarded like she was nothing. There should have been outrage. There should have been an urgent and thorough investigation. But what happened instead was a carefully controlled narrative, one that Sheriff Dwayne Calloway made sure never strayed beyond the version of events he wanted the public to believe. The official statement came within hours of the discovery. A press conference was held right outside the sheriff's office. Calloway stood in front of the cameras, his expression solemn, his voice steady as he addressed the town. LaToya Harris was a respected member of our community, and her loss is a tragedy, he began, pausing for effect. At this time, our investigators are working tirelessly to determine what happened. However, based on preliminary findings, we have reason to believe this was an isolated incident, a robbery gone wrong. That was it, a robbery gone wrong. No further explanation. No evidence presented. Just a blanket statement meant to shut down speculation before it even began. And just like that, the case was already being swept under the rug. The problem? LaToya's family wasn't buying it. Her sister, Keisha Harris, was the first to speak out. She stood outside the sheriff's department just hours after the press conference, holding back tears, her voice shaking with fury. "My sister was not robbed," she said. "Nothing was taken. Her wallet was still on her, her jewelry, her phone. How is that a robbery? Someone murdered her and they knew exactly what they were doing." The reporters took note of that. The town took note of that. And suddenly the so-called isolated incident didn't seem so simple anymore. Then came the inconsistencies. At first, Calloway had insisted that there were no immediate suspects. But then, a day later, another statement was issued, this time suggesting that LaToya may have been involved with the wrong people. It was subtle, almost dismissive, but the implication was there. Maybe she had gotten mixed up with something dangerous. Maybe she wasn't as innocent as everyone believed. Keisha wasn't having it. "They're trying to make it seem like my sister was living some kind of double life," she snapped in an interview with a local news station. "She was a teacher. She spent her nights volunteering. You tell me, who was she supposedly involved with? Because all I see is a woman who wanted to help people." The cracks in the sheriff's version of events started to show, and the people of the town, the ones who had blindly trusted Calloway for years, were beginning to feel it too. Then an even bigger problem surfaced. A witness, a woman who had been working at the diner the night LaToya vanished, came forward. She had already told police what she saw, LaToya speaking to a man in a black SUV. But something didn't sit right with her about how quickly the case was being closed, how little the police seemed to care about following up. So she did something she wasn't supposed to do. She reached out to Keisha. "She wasn't alone," the woman said in a hushed voice, looking over her shoulder like she was afraid someone might be watching. "She was talking to someone, a man in a black SUV. I don't know who he was, but she looked nervous. Like she didn't want to be there." Keisha's stomach twisted. "Did you tell the police?" The woman nodded. "Yeah, and you know what they said? We'll look into it. But then they never called me back." That was the moment Keisha knew. This wasn't just incompetence. This was deliberate. The investigation wasn't being mishandled. It was being buried. And the one person who had the power to bury it? Sheriff Dwayne Calloway. The pressure started building. News stations picked up the story. Social media caught wind of the inconsistencies. People in the community, The same ones who had once viewed Calloway as a respected authority started whispering, questioning, demanding answers, and that was when things got dangerous. Keisha started getting strange phone calls in the middle of the night. No one spoke on the other end, just silence, breathing, and then a click. She noticed a car parked outside her house more than once, a black SUV sitting just far enough down the street that she couldn't make out the driver. And then, one evening, as she was locking up her front door, her phone buzzed, a blocked number, a single text. "Drop it." Keisha stared at the screen, her blood running cold. She was supposed to be afraid. She was supposed to back down. But all it did was prove what she already suspected. LaToya's murder wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a cover-up, and the man behind it was the same man who had promised justice. LaToya Harris hadn't just stumbled upon a dangerous secret. She had been actively looking for it. For months she had been quietly collecting information, piecing together a puzzle that no one else seemed to notice, or maybe no one else dared to acknowledge. It started small: news clippings, missing persons reports, stories whispered at community meetings about children vanishing without a trace. At first, she thought it was just a tragic coincidence. Runaways, broken homes, kids slipping through the cracks. But the deeper she looked, the harder it became to ignore the patterns. The numbers didn't make sense. Too many missing children. Too many cases closed without explanation. And too many of those cases had one thing in common: the involvement, directly or indirectly, of the sheriff's department. Specifically, Sheriff Dwayne Calloway's department. At first, she didn't want to believe it. The idea that a man so deeply embedded in the town's leadership could be involved in something as monstrous as child trafficking seemed impossible. But every road she went down, every report she cross-checked, kept leading back to one place: the sheriff's office. More disturbingly, some of the officers linked to these cases had since retired or transferred out of town, their records quietly sealed. Others still worked under Calloway's command, their names buried in paperwork, never directly tied to the missing children, but always close enough to be suspicious. LaToya wasn't a detective, she wasn't a journalist, but she knew when something was wrong, and she couldn't ignore it. She started keeping a notebook, handwritten notes, printouts, copies of reports she had managed to get from contacts at the local courthouse. It wasn't just names. It was dates, times, locations, everything she had found, carefully documented. And then came the final piece. 2 weeks before she was murdered, she had been working on something bigger. She had reached out to a journalist, someone outside of town, someone she believed wouldn't be compromised by local politics. A man named Anthony Graves, an investigative reporter who had a reputation for exposing corruption in small-town law enforcement. Graves later revealed that LaToya had left him a voicemail the night before she disappeared. "I think I found something." Her voice crackled over the recording, low, urgent. "It's bigger than I thought. They're using law enforcement to cover it up. I have names. I have proof. But I think they know I've been looking. I don't feel safe." She paused. A breath. A hesitation. "If anything happens to me, don't let this go." That voicemail was the last time anyone outside of town heard from LaToya. Graves tried calling her back the next morning. No answer. He sent an email, then another. Silence. He assumed she had gotten cold feet, that she had changed her mind about going public with what she had found. Then, 2 days later, the news broke. LaToya Harris, dead. Execution style. Graves knew instantly that this was no coincidence. He went back to the voicemail, listening to it over and over. She had been afraid. She had felt them closing in. And then, just like that, she was gone. He tried to access her emails, the ones they had exchanged in the weeks before her death. But something was off. His inbox showed error messages. The attachments she had sent, documents, files, were missing. His personal email had been compromised. Then his phone started acting strange, calls dropping, text messages he never received. And one night, while working late in his office, his computer screen flickered. A single message appeared in his inbox from an unknown sender. "Forget her. Forget everything." And then the email deleted itself before he could even take a screenshot. That was when he realized whoever LaToya had been investigating wasn't just powerful. They were watching, and now they knew he was looking too. If you have gotten to the stage of this true crime story and you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit notification bell to support our channel. Sheriff Dwayne Calloway had spent decades building his reputation as an untouchable figure in law enforcement. He knew how to command a room, how to control a narrative, how to turn scrutiny into sympathy when needed. But this time, something was different. The cracks in his story weren't just forming, they were widening and fast. When the media started pressing for details about LaToya Harris's murder, Calloway did what he always did. He took control. He appeared on camera, stone-faced and authoritative, insisting that his department was doing everything in its power to find her killer. But the more he spoke, the more people began to notice something off about his statements. The biggest problem? His alibi. Calloway claimed that on the night LaToya disappeared, he had been attending a sheriff's conference in Dallas, a 2-hour drive away. His exact words, "I was out of town handling official business. I didn't even know about the case until I was informed the next morning." That should have been the end of it. A solid alibi. But then, an investigative journalist, one who had taken an interest in the case after hearing Anthony Graves speak out, decided to dig deeper. And what he found shattered the sheriff's carefully crafted story. Traffic camera footage, pulled from a gas station just outside of town, showed Calloway's car heading back toward the area late that night, around the same time LaToya was last seen alive. The timestamp was clear. The image quality was grainy, but the license plate was unmistakable. Calloway had been in town. So why had he lied? The journalist published his findings, and suddenly, Calloway was forced to address the inconsistencies. At first, he dismissed the footage as a misunderstanding, claiming that his car had been borrowed by another officer. But when pressed on who had supposedly driven it, he refused to give a name. Then came the anonymous tip. A former deputy, someone who had worked under Calloway for years before quietly resigning, contacted Keisha Harris, LaToya's sister. The message was short, typed on a piece of paper and left at her doorstep in the dead of night. There's more to this than you know. LaToya wasn't the first to see something she shouldn't have. The department buries things. They always have. Don't stop digging. Keisha's hands shook as she read it. Whoever had left that message was risking everything. And that only meant one thing. This was bigger than she had even imagined. Then, another strange thing happened. LaToya's apartment had been locked down as part of the investigation, with police officers assigned to catalog her personal belongings. But when Keisha was finally allowed inside to gather her sister's things, she noticed something was missing. LaToya's laptop. It wasn't just gone, it had vanished without a trace. Everything else was still there. Her books, her clothes, even the notebook where she had kept handwritten notes about the missing children. But the one thing that likely contained the digital records of her research, the files she had been compiling before she died, was gone. When Keisha asked about it, the officers handling the case shrugged it off. "We didn't find a laptop," one of them said. That was a lie. Keisha knew for a fact that LaToya had kept her laptop on her desk. She used it every night, and yet now it had simply disappeared? Who had taken it? And more importantly, what was on it that someone didn't want the world to see? The case against Sheriff Dwayne Calloway was unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted. What had once been a tragic, isolated murder was now revealing itself to be something much darker, something that reached far beyond LaToya Harris's death. The town was no longer whispering about corruption. They were shouting, demanding answers. And just when it seemed like the truth might remain buried, someone from Calloway's own past came forward with a revelation that no one saw coming. His name was Marcus Jefferson, a retired detective who had once worked under Calloway. For years, Jefferson had stayed silent. He had seen things he couldn't forget, things that had kept him awake at night long after he left the force. But he had told himself that speaking out wouldn't change anything, that Calloway was too powerful, too deeply connected. But then he heard about LaToya, a woman murdered execution style, a teacher who had been looking into missing children, a case that was being buried before it even had a chance to be solved. And that was when Jefferson made a decision. He wasn't going to be silent anymore. Late one night, Jefferson contacted Anthony Graves, the journalist who had received LaToya's final voicemail. His message was short but direct. "I have proof." Graves wasted no time. He arranged a secret meeting in a neighboring town, away from prying eyes. Jefferson arrived wearing a hooded sweatshirt, glancing over his shoulder before sitting down across from Graves. His hands trembled as he slid a small flash drive across the table. "This is everything," he whispered. "I've held on to this for years, but I can't keep it to myself anymore." Graves plugged the drive into his laptop, his pulse pounding. What he saw made his stomach turn. Surveillance footage, secret recordings, documents with names, dates, and transactions. But the worst part? A video. The grainy, black and white footage showed a dimly lit parking lot behind an abandoned warehouse. A black SUV pulled in. A tall figure stepped out. Even in the poor quality, there was no mistaking him. Sheriff Dwayne Calloway, and he wasn't alone. Moments later, another vehicle pulled up. Several men stepped out, exchanging hushed words. Then, something chilling. A group of children, no older than 10 or 12, were led out of the second vehicle. Calloway glanced around, then gave a small nod. One of the men handed him a thick envelope. Cash. He took it, counted through the bills, then motioned for the others to proceed. The transaction was smooth, routine, as if they had done this many times before. Graves's throat went dry. This wasn't just corruption. This was human trafficking, and Calloway was in the middle of it. Jefferson exhaled sharply. "I tried to report it years ago," he said. "Took it to Internal Affairs. The next day I got a transfer offer. Either I left quietly, or I ended up in a body bag." He shook his head. "I left, but I kept the evidence, just in case." Graves knew what he had to do. He contacted federal authorities, sending them copies of the files. The response was immediate. Within days, the FBI launched an undercover investigation into Calloway's department, secretly monitoring his activities, his communications, his financial records. And what they found? Confirmed everything. Large, unaccounted-for cash deposits in Calloway's bank accounts, unregistered properties linked to his name, connections to known traffickers operating across state lines. The truth was no longer just a theory. It was fact. Sheriff Calloway wasn't just protecting criminals. He was one of them. The walls of Sheriff Dwayne Calloway's empire were crumbling. For years, he had operated with impunity, using his badge as a shield, his power as a weapon. He had silenced those who got too close, erased evidence that threatened to expose him, and maintained an image of a respected lawman while overseeing one of the most horrifying crimes imaginable. But the truth had finally caught up with him. The arrest wasn't quiet. It wasn't a discreet affair handled behind closed doors to save face. It was a spectacle. The FBI, alongside Texas Rangers and federal marshals, stormed the sheriff's office early one morning, moving with the kind of precision meant for high-profile criminals. Agents in tactical gear flooded the building, securing files, confiscating computers, and placing officers under immediate suspension pending further investigation. And then, there was Calloway himself. He was in his office when they came for him, sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen as if he already knew what was coming. When the door burst open, he didn't fight. He didn't argue. He simply looked up, met the eyes of the lead agent, and let out a long breath. "This is a mistake," he muttered as they cuffed him. But everyone in that room knew it wasn't. By noon, his mugshot was on every major news outlet in the country. The charges. The indictment was damning. Calloway was charged with conspiracy to commit human trafficking, obstruction of justice murder in the first degree, for orchestrating LaToya Harris's execution, abuse of power. The evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the financial records, the testimonies of whistleblowers. It was a case too big to bury. And Calloway wasn't the only one going down. Over the next several weeks, more arrests followed. 14 officers from Calloway's department were implicated in the operation, some for direct involvement, others for knowingly covering it up. Among them was Deputy Stephen Hargrove, Calloway's right-hand man, who was found to have facilitated the movement of victims across state lines. His bank accounts revealed suspicious wire transfers, all leading back to shell corporations tied to the trafficking ring. The deeper the FBI dug, the bigger the conspiracy became. Calloway's network wasn't just a local operation. It spanned multiple states, with traffickers using rural police departments as safe zones to operate undetected. Children were being smuggled through Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, passed from corrupt officials to criminal enterprises. The level of rot within law enforcement was more profound than anyone had imagined. When Calloway's trial began, it captivated the town. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and members of LaToya Harris's family, who sat in the front row every day, watching as the man responsible for her death was forced to answer for his crimes. The prosecution didn't hold back. They presented wiretap recordings of Calloway discussing payments with traffickers. They played the surveillance footage of him standing in that dark parking lot, sealing deals that destroyed lives. They called witness after witness, from former officers to trafficking survivors, all painting the same damning picture. A man who had built his career on violence, intimidation, and exploitation. Calloway sat stone-faced throughout the trial. He never took the stand, never showed remorse. But the jury didn't hesitate. Guilty. On all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even with Calloway behind bars, there were still unsettling questions that haunted this case. Why had Calloway personally taken over the investigation from the start? At the time, it had seemed like a sheriff dedicated to solving a murder in his town. But in hindsight, it was a blatant move to control the narrative, ensuring that no outside agencies got too close. If he hadn't taken charge, would the murder of LaToya Harris have been solved sooner? Would she have gotten justice before the FBI had to step in? And then there was the mystery of LaToya's laptop, the one that vanished the same night she was killed. Authorities never recovered it, and no one could say for certain what was on it. But considering what she had been investigating, one theory stood out. She had evidence that could have exposed Calloway before he could cover his tracks. Could there have been names? Transactions? Was it possible that there were even more officials involved? People who were still walking free, still abusing their power? Perhaps the most disturbing question of all, had this been a last-minute panic move? Or had Calloway planned LaToya's execution from the moment he realized she was getting too close? If it had been a panicked reaction, that suggested he had been caught off guard, scrambling to silence her before she could go public. But if it had been planned, who else knew? Who had helped orchestrate it? Who had looked the other way while it happened? If Calloway thought killing LaToya Harris would erase the truth, he was wrong, because even though she was gone, her fight didn't end with her death. Her family, led by her sister Keisha, turned their grief into action. They campaigned tirelessly, pushing lawmakers to introduce the Harris Act, a bill designed to prevent corruption in law enforcement by increasing transparency and independent oversight. And it worked. LaToya Harris wasn't just a victim. She became a symbol, a reminder that one person could make a difference, even at the cost of their own life. Sheriff Dwayne Calloway was just one man, but his case revealed something bigger, something that should make all of us ask hard questions. How many others have been silenced before their voices could be heard? How many crimes have been buried, hidden behind the badges of those who were meant to protect us? And most importantly, who's still out there? This isn't just a story, it's a reality. Corruption in law enforcement isn't new, and cases like LaToya Harris's show us how far some will go to protect their secrets. What do you think? Do you believe Calloway acted alone, or were there higher powers shielding him? Should law enforcement oversight be stronger across the country? Have you heard of similar cases in small towns near you? Let's talk about it in the comments, because if we stop talking, we stop fighting. If you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, inhumanity, abuse, to mention a few, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you.